Hey, welcome back. So up to this point, we've learned to leverage pivot tables as a very powerful tool to analyze large amounts of data quickly. But providing truly effective data analysis is more than just about crunching numbers. It's also about presenting your data in a way that is easily understandable and attractively formatted to a broad audience. So in this one, we're going to clean up our example pivot table here to make it something we wouldn't be ashamed to present to the CEO. So my first step here is actually going to be to remove call type description from my columns area. While that is a useful breakout to have, as you'll see later, it's perfectly possible to have more than one pivot table pointing to the same data set. And when you find that you've dragged so many fields into your pivot table that it's hard to reason about what each number in an individual cell means, it's probably time to start removing fields. So I'll go to my field list and then remove my call type description field. And now I think I'll actually replace my dates in my row area with our original hierarchy of site, manager, and employee. So I'll remove my months field, my days field, and my call timestamp field, and then I'll add back in my site field, my manager name field, and finally my employee name field. So now, instead of a pivot table that's kind of trying to be all things to all audiences, we have a clean, focused breakout of 3 primary statistics by an employee hierarchy that goes from manager all the way to site. So the first step in our visual cleanup here will be to properly name and format our metrics in columns B through D. For example, this column name count of call ID isn't exactly descriptive and doesn't really tell an end user of our pivot table what the numbers in that column really mean. And furthermore, considering the numbers in this column typically are so large, it would be nice to format them with a comma in the thousands place. So how do we go about doing that? Well, first I'll tweak the layout of my pivot table field list to only show the areas section 2 by 2. So now we've got a cleaner view of all the fields we've dragged into our pivot. And then I'll click the arrow to the right of my count of call ID metric, and then choose Value Field Settings. Now here, in the Custom Name dialog box, I have the option to type in, as you might guess, a custom name for this field. So I think I'll call it Calls Received. Now as to adding the comma in the thousands place of the numbers, all I have to do is click this Number Format button in the bottom left corner of the dialog box, and then I can format those numbers the way I would format any other number in an Excel spreadsheet. This Format Cells dialog box should look pretty familiar to you. So I'll go to Number, and then because our number in this column is a count, I won't need any decimal places, so I'll place a 0 there, and then I'll put a check mark next to Use Thousands Separator, and then click OK, and then OK once again. And now we have a meaningful name for our column that contains data about the number of calls our sites received. And these numbers have been formatted with a comma in the thousands place. So now let's take some similar steps to clean up our Sum of Call Abandoned field. So again, I'll click that field in my pivot table field list, choose Value Field Settings, and then I'll assign a custom name of Calls Abandoned. And again, I'll format this number to have a comma in the thousands place with no decimal places. And then lastly, for my average of call duration field, I'll format that to have 1 decimal place, since this is a number that potentially could be fractional. So again, clicking that in the fields list, I'll change the name to Average Call Duration, and then format the number to have 1 digit after the decimal place. And I think you can agree we're looking way better already. But there's a lot more to formatting pivot tables than just formatting the numbers in our metrics. So if we click this Design Contextual tab in the ribbon, on the right we'll see a number of built-in pivot table styles, very similar to the styles that we were able to apply to Excel tables. So if I click the down arrow to the right of these, I can hover over any of these for a preview of how our pivot table would look with that given style applied. Now, my personal preference has always been the light blue pivot style medium, so I'll go ahead and click that one. Obviously, your taste or the taste of your audience may differ, but that's why Excel has so many built-in formatting options available. Now, another visual feature of our pivot table to consider is its layout. So over on the left side of this Design tab, we'll see a button called Report Layout. Now, if I click that, I'll see that we actually have a few different layout options. There's Compact Form, Outline Form, and Tabular Form. Now, the current and default layout, which is the one I would recommend for most cases, is Compact Form. So if we select that, nothing changes. But if we change our layout to Outline Form, you'll see that now each of our fields that we dragged into the rows area of our pivot table field list, basically our row groupings, gets its own column. So Site is now in column A, Manager Name is now in column B, and Employee Name is in column C. This can be a helpful layout if you really want to emphasize the levels of hierarchy in your pivot table and how the different fields in the rows area relate to each other. Then the tabular form is really very similar to the outline form. It just gives you a little less breathing room visually. This is one that I personally wouldn't recommend, since the outline form is so similar, but provides a little more breathing room visually. But again, in the vast majority of cases, the default compact layout is perfectly sufficient, so we'll go ahead and revert to that. Another important visual aspect of pivot tables is subtotals. These are the aggregations of our metrics that we see at each level of the hierarchy in our pivot. For example, we see manager level roll-ups of our 3 metrics for each manager in our pivot table in the row in which that manager appears. This 10,872 number to the right of Elsie Taplin represents the total number of calls received by Elsie's employees. Likewise, we also have subtotals at the highest level of hierarchy in our pivot, which is Site. Hence why we also see these even larger numbers in the same row as our Aurora, Colorado row header. Now, these subtotals will appear in your pivot table by default, and most of the time you'll want to keep them. They're very useful, and typically people want to see how these metrics break down at each level of hierarchy in your pivot table. However, you do have the option to manipulate whether or not they appear and where they appear. So if we click this Subtotals button on the left side of the Design tab, we'll see that we can opt to not show subtotals, in which case all of those roll-ups at each level of the hierarchy disappear. In this case, after choosing this option, we only see our metrics for the lowest level in our hierarchy, which is employee. Again, most of the time not what you're going to want, but it's worth noting that that is an option you have in case, for whatever reason, your audience finds the subtotals to introduce too much clutter into your pivot tables. But for our purposes, I'm going to add our subtotals back, and I'll make sure to do it at the top of the group, because while you do have the option to add them to the bottom of the group, it's just not as aesthetically pleasing and will be confusing to most users of a pivot table. So not only does our pivot table have subtotals by default that break down our metrics for each level of hierarchy in the pivot table, it also has grand totals that display all-in numbers for our metrics calculated across all the rows in our source data. So to see these, first I'll collapse our site level groupings by right-clicking our Aurora, Colorado site, and then hovering over Expand and Collapse, and then clicking Collapse Entire Field. And now if you look at the bottom of our newly condensed pivot table, you see that there is a grand total row that adds up our 3 metrics for all the rows in our source data set. Again, like with our subtotals, you'll want to keep grand totals in your pivot tables most of the time. Most users would be interested in comparing the numbers at each level of our hierarchy with the all-in number at the very bottom. However, just like with subtotals, Excel does give us the option to switch these grand totals on and off for all the positions they can occupy in the pivot. So if we hit this Grand Totals button on our Design tab, you'll see that we can turn grand totals off for rows and columns, on for rows and columns, on for rows only, and on for columns only. Now, because our metrics are oriented by columns, it really only makes sense for our grand totals to be on for columns. But because our metrics are oriented that way, it really doesn't matter if we choose on for columns only or on for rows and columns. So if I remove our grand totals by choosing off for rows and columns, and then go back to my grand totals button and choose on for columns only, we see our pivot table looks just like it did before. And then if I turn our grand totals off again, and then choose on for rows and columns, it's the same layout as before, because again, our metrics are oriented by columns and not by rows. All right, so we've got our pivot table looking sharp, but there's still a lot more to learn about pivot tables. Up next, we'll look at how you can add filtering to pivot tables to give you even more dimensions by which to slice and dice your data. I'll see you then.